On Christmas night, I sat with roast beef and pecan pie untouched, while my son celebrated elsewhere. Then came the cruelest twist. He and his wife filed to control every dollar I had, including my $600,000 home and our lakeside cabin. It felt like being erased from my own life. But Evelyn, my late wife, had planned for this moment. What I heard inside changed everything. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from in the comments. The living room was quiet that night, the kind of quiet that almost buzzes in your ears. The yellow lamp in the corner threw a soft glow across the wooden floorboards I had installed myself back in 1995. My hands still remember the feel of the nails and the hammer, the ache in my back from crouching down, the pride when Evelyn said it looked as good as something a professional would have done. On the mantel above the fireplace, our wedding photo sat in its old silver frame, a reminder of the years we had built together. I sat in my recliner, staring at the photo, and all I could think of was the boy in the graduation robe whose education I paid for, the same boy who now wanted to erase me from my own home. I remembered cutting that check for his tuition, $58,000 over 4 years. It was not easy. I worked extra hours, and I sold a small patch of land I had inherited from my uncle just to make sure Andrew could walk across that stage with pride. I thought of the Toyota I bought him when he got his first job offer. $24,000. The smile on his face that day made me believe it was worth every penny. And then the wedding. $12,000 toward the reception, the flowers, the endless stream of champagne glasses that clinked in celebration. Evelyn used to put her hand on mine and say, "We give so he can stand taller." I believed her. I wanted my son to stand tall, to walk with confidence into his life. Now that same son was trying to cut me down, to take away the very roof that sheltered him when he was young. I could almost hear Evelyn's voice in my ear, but it was faint, swallowed by the bitterness of what he had become. The house around me felt heavy with history. This home, now valued around $620,000, wasn't just bricks and wood. It was the smell of Thanksgiving turkeys roasted in the oven, the sound of Andrew's feet pounding up the staircase when he was late for school, the marks on the doorframe where we measured his height year after year. I walked to the hallway and let my fingers brush over the family photographs that lined the wall. His kindergarten smile with a missing tooth. His high school football team picture, with him clutching the ball with a grin that filled the frame. And then our family picture at the cabin on Maple Harbor. That cabin, worth about $320,000, had the smell of pine inside, the view of the lake that looked like glass at sunrise, and the old rowboat leaning against the dock. Every nail, every plank, every picture frame was a piece of our story. And now, with a few strokes of a pen, with a legal document I hadn't signed, all of it could be stripped from me and placed in his hands. I whispered out loud, though no one was there to hear it. Everything we built could end up in someone else's hands. The thought tasted bitter on my tongue. The shock of Christmas still lingered. That table set with roast beef, mashed potatoes, and pecan pie had never felt so cold. The pecan pie was Evelyn's recipe. I had followed it to the letter, even though it never tasted quite as good when I made it. I sat there, looking at her empty chair, hearing the tick of the clock echo in the silence, and then the cruel reality hit me like ice water. My son was not late. He was not caught in traffic. He had chosen another table, another home, another family. I saw the photos online later, his arm around Sophie, their glasses raised in a toast. They looked happy. And I, sitting in my own home, felt invisible. The morning after, I brewed a cup of cinnamon coffee, just as Evelyn used to, and stared at the steam curling up. I whispered into the air, "Ev, am I reading this right? Did our son really choose them over me?" The house felt colder with every sip, the empty chair beside me a constant reminder that this wasn't just a busy holiday, it was rejection. It wasn't about being forgotten. It was about being left behind. But as I sat there, a memory surfaced, one I had tried to bury. Years ago, a contractor from Tennessee called me about a payment. $16,500, supposedly authorized by me, for a job I had never requested. I remembered holding the check in my hand, my signature scrawled across it, but I had never signed it. The ink was just slightly off, and the line of the H in Henry was too straight. Andrew had shrugged when I asked about it, said maybe I was getting forgetful. Back then, I didn't want to cause trouble. I told myself it was a mistake, that I must have forgotten. But deep down, I knew it wasn't me. It was the first red flag, the first hint that my son might not just be careless, but cunning. And I, desperate to keep peace in the family, had closed my eyes. I hadn't wanted to see the storm brewing. That storm was now crashing down on me. That morning, something urged me outside. The bird feeder Evelyn used to fill every week with sunflower seeds was still hanging by the porch. She always loved watching the cardinals flutter there. I brushed off the snow and felt something taped underneath. A plain envelope. My hands shook as I opened it, and there was her handwriting, steady and familiar. The letter had been dated just days before she passed. If Andrew shuts you out, this will make sense. Inside was a small key and a note pointing me toward her desk drawer. I went back inside, opened the drawer, and there it was. The deed to the cabin, already secured in my name, and the name of Harold Grant, the CPA she had trusted with our finances. Evelyn had known. She had seen something in Andrew that I had refused to see. She had built a shield for me, one that could withstand the betrayal I was facing now. Holding that key, I felt a shift inside me. The grief and shock that had pinned me down began to loosen. I brewed another pot of coffee, laid out the deed, the key, and the letter on the table, and slipped them into a clear binder. My hands were steadier now. I picked up the phone and called Mark Rivera, my old neighbor, a retired attorney. "Mark," I said quietly, "I need your eyes on something. I think Andrew is trying to take me down." He didn't ask questions. He just told me to bring everything over. Before I hung up, I looked again at the key. Evelyn's key. It was as if she was still guiding me, still protecting me. I pressed it in my palm and whispered, "They won't erase me. Not now. Not ever." The living room, with its yellow light and old wedding photo, no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a war room. The documents were my weapons, the memories my armor. I knew I couldn't change the fact that my son had chosen betrayal, but I could decide how I would face it. For the first time in weeks, I stood tall in my own home, ready to fight. I woke before sunrise with Evelyn's key in my hand and the cabin deed spread like a compass on the kitchen table. The house breathed the way old houses do, a soft hiss in the vents and a pop in the baseboards, as if it were telling me to move. I had sat with grief long enough. I had stared at the empty chair long enough. Feelings had their hour. Today belonged to facts. I brewed coffee strong and a little bitter, the way I drink it when I need a clear head, and stacked what Evelyn left me. The deed, the note with Harold Grant's name, the envelope that had been taped under the bird feeder. I let the small weight of the key steady my hand. I spoke aloud so I would hear my resolve. One clear step at a time, Henry. The clock over the stove said 7:22. By 8:30, I was walking into the bank. Ms. Ramirez kept a tidy office with navy carpet, a jar of pens, and a framed picture of two kids in Little League uniforms. She shook my hand with both of hers. I told her I wanted boundaries. I said I needed text and email alerts on every transaction over $1,000. I said I wanted a temporary freeze on my savings, $180,000, until we could review signatures against the card on file. I asked for printed statements for the last 6 months, stamped in the branch, with a note stating I appeared in person to request them. She wrote as I spoke, then read it back line by line. Her voice stayed even, but the skin around her eyes tightened when I said freeze. She changed my online password while I watched, reset my phone PIN, and had me choose a verbal passphrase only I would know. I chose a line Evelyn used when storms rolled over the lake. "Hold your ground, Henry." She printed receipts, initialed the corners, and slid a blue folder with my name across the desk. She asked if anything unusual had happened. I told her I had a feeling someone might try to attach themselves to my accounts. Feelings are not proof, but they are the smoke you look at before the fire shows itself. Before I left, she offered one sentence I kept. Slow theft is still theft, and it starts politely. I thanked her and carried the folder out like a shield. My next stop was Dr. Patel's office. The waiting room smelled like lemon cleaner, and a fish tank burbled in the corner. I told the nurse I needed a cognitive screen today. She looked at my face and decided not to ask why. Dr. Patel came in with that quiet steadiness he carries. He asked me to follow his finger, to repeat 5 words, to draw a clock, and set the hands to 11:10. He asked what day it was, who the president was, and whether I could count backward by 7s. I answered, not fast to impress him, but steady enough to satisfy the test. When he finished, he typed a letter while I sat. Henry Cole demonstrates full cognitive capacity. He printed it on letterhead, signed it, and made 2 copies. He met my eyes and told me to call if I needed anything else. In the hallway, an older couple gave me that nod. Strangers give a man who is carrying something heavy but upright. I slid the letter into the blue folder and felt taller by half an inch. From there, I drove to the brick building above the bakery where Harold Grant kept his office. The bell over the door chimed, and the smell of warm bread drifted up the stairwell. The receptionist remembered Evelyn's name before mine. Harold came out with a file already in his hand. "Evelyn asked me to be ready for you," he said, as if reading a line neither of us wanted to speak. We sat by the window, and he opened to a simple summary. 5 years EA, Evelyn had created a private trust with $480,000 and named me the sole trustee. No successor, no co-trustee. Clear language gives me control. Harold laid each page on the table like tools on a bench. I asked how to tuck the cabin under that roof. He advised a deed transfer into the trust with a protective clause that would make any attempt to sell or pledge it without my signature a dead end. He scheduled a notary for the following week, explained the tax basics, and gave me a checklist as plain as a grocery list. When I left Harold's office, I drove out to Maple Harbor. The lake looked like a sheet of steel under a gray sky. I unlocked the door and breathed in the smell of pine and old summers. I built a small fire, set water to boil, and laid the letters and the bank folder on the kitchen table we bought at a garage sale 20 years ago. I spoke my plan into the quiet because saying it makes it real. Step 1, alerts and freeze. Step 2, cognitive letter. Step 3, trust shield for the cabin. Step 4, document everything, even tone of voice. I waited until the kettle sang, then drank from the chipped mug I keep there. It tasted like resolve. Back home, I poured soup into a bowl, set the blue folder beside it, and called Andrew. I kept my voice even. I said I wanted to check in. He jumped in with that smooth tone he uses when he thinks he is managing a situation. He said he and Sophie were only trying to help streamline things. He said finances can get confusing after a loss. He said he could take a few tasks off my plate so I could grieve. He used the word help 3 times in 2 minutes. I let him talk until he ran out of air. Then I asked a single question. Help for whom? He laughed a small laugh and said, "Dad, for you, of course." I told him I was fine handling my own money. He said he respected that. The call ended with a bright note that did not ring true. The next afternoon, a courier delivered a bank envelope. It was thin but stiff, the kind of mail that dries your mouth because it looks official. Inside was a copy of a faxed request to the ADA cosigner for my savings account. The typed name under mine was Sophie Cole. The signature said Henry Cole in a hand that tried too hard to be mine. The H started from a place I never start. The loop in the Y drooped shyly. The date on the cover sheet was exactly a week ago. I stood at the counter and felt that old bruise along the ribs of trust turn dark again. I drove back to the branch and asked for Ms. Ramirez. She closed her office door after she saw the fax. She pulled up my signature card and compared it. She did not need long. She said we would flag the request as fraudulent, add an internal note that any changes require in-person notarized orders, and file an incident report. She asked if I wanted to involve the police. I told her to file the report first and copy me. I asked for the incident number and a stamped printout. She printed, stamped, and slid copies into my blue folder. She looked tired, the way good people look when familiar tricks show up again. I did not call Andrew. I drove to his house because there are times a man should look another man in the eye. He opened the door with a face that wanted to pretend this was a surprise visit. I told him what had arrived from the bank. He said it must be a mix-up. He said maybe someone at the branch misunderstood. He said Sophie only wanted to help if I forgot a password. He said softly, like a breadcrumb toward a story he might tell a judge. I did not raise my voice. I said I had a letter from Dr. Patel proving my mind was sound. His mouth flattened. He said he only wanted what was best. I told him I did too, and I left. That night I set every page on the dining table and opened a fresh yellow legal pad. At the top, I wrote evidence. Under it, I listed each piece with a date and what it showed. Alerts set for over $1,000. Savings freeze at $180,000. 6 months of stamped statements, requested in person. Cognitive letter from Dr. Patel. Trust summary from Harold, plus the planned deed transfer. Fax to add Sophie as co-cosigner, flagged fraudulent. Bank incident report number. Notes on my conversations, times, and numbers. When I finished, the list looked like a ladder. I felt myself climb a rung. In the morning, I called Dana Crowley, a name Mark Rivera gave me when he retired. She answered on the second ring with a voice that carried level ground. I told her I needed counsel in a family matter involving money, dignity, and pressure that came with polite words. I said I had documents and believed a guardianship petition might be coming. She told me to bring everything at 2 o'clock. She told me to keep my tone calm if anyone called before then. She told me to keep writing things down, names, times, and what was said. It felt like being handed a map. Dana's office sat on the 3rd floor of an old building with tall windows and radiators that ticked. She wore a plain suit and a look that said she listened for a living. I set the folder on her table and walked her through every page. She asked a few questions and took notes with a fountain pen. When I finished, she leaned back and folded her hands. She said what I was describing had a shape she knew well. First comes a story that I am confused about, then comes a helpful offer, then comes a petition dressed up as protection. She outlined what we would do if that door appeared. We would file a response with exhibits. We would ask for a prompt hearing. We would request a protective order against interference with my property or access to my accounts. We would add the fraudulent facts to show motive and method. We would gather written statements from people who had done business with me in the last months. We would use the cognitive letter to undercut any claim that I could not manage my affairs. She said the law is made of stories built from facts that do not wobble. I told her I had no interest in wobbling. On the drive home, the light turned the color of steel. I set Evelyn's key beside the blue folder on the kitchen table and cooked a simple dinner. I ate standing up because I had more to do and did not want to sink into a chair. I cleaned the dishes, dried them, and slid the folder into my bag. I checked the locks and turned off the lamp by the wedding photo. Before bed, I stood in the doorway and spoke a quiet line into the room. Keep me steady. Keep me clear. Keep me kind where I can be and firm where I must be. A text from Andrew buzzed just after 9. He said he was worried about me. He said Sophie had talked to someone who knew a good elder law attorney who could make things easier. He said selling the cabin in the spring might be wise to reduce maintenance and put the proceeds somewhere safe. He used that word twice, safe, as if saying it would make the grab gentler. I did not reply. I set the phone face down and let the room settle. In the morning, Ms. Ramirez called to say a follow-up number had asked whether the cosigner's request was complete. She had logged the call and given no information. She had prepared 2 notarization forms to smooth the deed transfer when Harold and I met with the notary. I thanked her and drove in to sign where she had flagged with small tabs. At the counter, she said her mother used to say, "Paper stands up when voices shake." I told her Evelyn would have liked her mother. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment one below to let me know you're here with me. On my way home, I stopped at the hardware store for batteries and saw Ellen behind the counter. She asked how I was in that plain way small towns ask. I told her I was getting my ducks in a row. I asked if she would write a short statement that I had placed orders, compared prices, and paid in person over the last months. She smiled and said she liked ducks that stayed in rows and would print something for me to pick up tomorrow. I bought the batteries and a bundle of cedar kindling because the nights had turned cold. That afternoon, I drove to Maple Harbor with the folder, the kindling, and a steady mind. I lit the stove, set a kettle on to sing, and laid the documents out on the table again. I tested myself by closing the folder and naming each piece in order, then opening it to see if I had missed anything. I practiced telling the story without heat. I wanted a judge or a banker or any stranger to hear calm truth in every line. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees and tapped a branch against the window. It sounded like someone asking to be let in. I decided the only thing I would let in was clarity. Dusk came early, and I headed back. A black sedan idled near the end of my street, then rolled away when I turned in. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was someone who liked watching porches. I did not chase shadows. I carried the folder inside and set it beside the key. I wrote Dana's name on a large envelope and tucked a clean copy set into it so I could hand it over without fumbling if the petition arrived. I made a list for the morning. Call Raj at the grocery for a short statement. Pick up Ellen's note, scan receipts, and file duplicates. I slept well for the first time in weeks. Morning came soft on the floorboards I had lain back in 1995. I made oatmeal and sprinkled cinnamon because Evelyn liked it that way. I spoke under my breath, not to a room, but to the woman who planned for me even after she left. Ev, I will hold my ground. I will not be erased. I laid the folder flat and smoothed the corners the way Evelyn used to smooth a tablecloth before guests arrived. Simple, careful, ready. I added fresh ink to the pen, labeled tabs, and sealed copies in a manila envelope. Rituals matter. They slow the pulse and sharpen the mind for me. Then I dialed Dana. I told her about the sedan and the follow-up call to the bank. I told her the facts had woken something in me that felt less like fear and more like resolve. If they are forging faxes, guardianship is next, I said. Then we get there first, she answered, with evidence. I looked at the neat stack on my table, at paper that told the truth without raising its voice, and felt the strength of a plan settle into place. They think I'm weak. They're about to learn. The knock on my front door that morning carried the weight of something official. I opened it to find a man in a gray jacket with a badge on his belt and a stack of papers in his hand. He didn't smile, only confirmed my name and handed me the envelope. My stomach tightened before I even slid it open. Petition for guardianship, filed by Andrew Cole and his wife, Sophie. I read the first lines twice to be sure my eyes weren't inventing the words. They were accusing me of diminished capacity, of reckless decisions, of burning through money I couldn't account for. They were asking the court to remove my right to manage my own affairs and place them as guardians over my estate. In black ink, my son had painted me as a liability. I sat down in the quiet kitchen, the papers spread across the table like a storm had blown them there. Evelyn's key glinted from the counter. I whispered to her picture on the fridge. "It's here, Ev. It's happening just like you feared." My chest ached, but not from confusion, from clarity. This was the move they had been circling toward, and now it was on paper with a court seal. I called Dana right away. She told me to bring everything in and to bring the folder with me. When I arrived, she had the petition already pulled up on her screen, her glasses low on her nose, her pen moving across a yellow pad. "They're painting you as isolated, forgetful, Reckless, she said. We'll paint you as active, capable, and part of your community. We'll paint you with proof. She tapped her pen on the table. Guardianship is serious. Judges don't grant it on suspicion. They grant it on evidence. And we've got evidence. Over the next week, Dana and I turned my life into a ledger of competence. We stacked 6 months of stamped bank statements, each one showing my in-person transactions. Ms. Ramirez printed receipts and signed notes verifying that I had initiated freezes and changes directly with her. We pulled the cognitive letter from Dr. Patel, the one with his signature across the bottom. Henry Cole demonstrates full cognitive capacity. Dana smiled at that line and said it could cut through a dozen accusations in one stroke. We gathered witnesses, too. Raj at the grocery wrote that I shopped weekly, compared prices, and paid at the counter himself. Ellen at the hardware store wrote that I had ordered lumber and paint, asked questions about grades, and paid in person. The local Veterans Hall provided a statement that I coordinated a winter coat drive, handled sign-ups, and delivered items to storage. Dana stacked each one into a binder until the pages leaned heavily. But just as I felt the wall of proof growing tall, the phone rang one morning with another blow. It was the insurance company. A woman's voice said they had received a request to change the beneficiary on my life insurance policy. $250,000, and the new beneficiary listed was Andrew Cole. She paused, perhaps expecting me to confirm it. My throat closed, but I managed to say, "That's not my request." She told me they had a scanned document with my supposed signature, submitted a few days earlier. My stomach turned to stone. It was not enough for them to try to control me while alive. They were reaching for the money set aside for when I was gone. I thanked her for alerting me, told her not to process it, and asked for a copy. She agreed to send the scan and log it as disputed. When the email arrived, I opened it on my desktop. The signature tried too hard again, the loop stiff, the letters unsure. I whispered aloud, "Not even my death would fill their appetite." Evelyn's photograph caught my eye. Her smile was frozen from the day we bought the cabin. I pressed my hand against the glass frame and said, "They want it all, Ev, but we'll stop them." Dana added the insurance fraud to the exhibit binder. "This shows motive," she said, tapping the page. "Guardianship for the living assets. Beneficiary fraud for the death benefits. Money is the thread, and judges follow threads." She marked the tab in red. The hearing date came faster than I thought. The county courthouse stood tall and old, its stone steps worn smooth by generations. Inside, the courtroom was paneled in dark wood, sunlight falling through tall windows that reached almost to the ceiling. The benches creaked when people shifted, and the air smelled of polish and paper. I sat at the table beside Dana, my folder of documents stacked like bricks before me. Across the aisle sat Andrew and Sophie with their attorney, a young man in a sharp suit who kept adjusting his tie. The judge, a woman with gray hair pulled back tight, entered, and the room rose. She glanced at the petition, then at me, then at the lawyers. Andrew avoided my eyes, staring at his hands. Sophie leaned toward him, whispering. The bailiff called the case, and the proceeding began. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 2 below to let me know you're here with me. Their lawyer stood first. His words rolled out smooth, rehearsed. He spoke of my supposed forgetfulness, of unpaid bills, of risks to my estate. He mentioned reckless withdrawals, said I had considered transferring property without reason, and hinted that I had lost track of basic tasks. He held up a page from the petition and declared that my estate, my house worth $620,000, my cabin worth $320,000, my accounts totaling hundreds of thousands, stood in jeopardy. He asked the court to protect me by appointing Andrew and Sophie as guardians. I listened in silence, my jaw tight, until it was Dana's turn. She rose, calm, deliberate, and opened the binder. She began with the bank records, walking the judge through receipts signed by tellers, notes initialed by managers, and statements showing my hand in every transaction. She read from Dr. Patel's letter in a steady voice. Henry Cole demonstrates full cognitive capacity. She introduced affidavits from Raj, from Ellen, from the Veterans Hall. Each one spoke of me paying, organizing, and deciding. She placed the trust document on the table, explaining how Evelyn had set it up and how I remained the sole trustee. She showed the deed transfer in progress, pulling the cabin further from their reach. Then she laid down the insurance letter. She explained the attempted beneficiary change, the fraudulent signature, and the motive it revealed. The judge leaned forward at that, her eyes narrowing. Dana called Mark Rivera to the stand. Mark testified that he had overheard Sophie say, "We can list the cabin before spring once he signs," in a conversation at a dinner party. Mark's voice carried weight, steady and unshaken. Finally, Dana asked if I wanted to speak. I rose slowly, buttoned my jacket, and stepped toward the podium. The courtroom was silent enough to hear the creak of the floorboards. I held the edges of the podium and spoke clearly. I built this life. With Evelyn, I built the house, the cabin, and he savings. I am not confused, and I am not reckless. I pay my bills, I plan my days, I keep my own pen. They think they can take my name from my accounts, my cabin from my trust, my insurance from my heirs. But I am here to say, I will not be erased. For a moment, the only sound was the scratch of the judge's pen. Then she looked up. She spoke slowly, her voice filling the room. The petition for guardianship is denied. Furthermore, this court issues a protective order prohibiting Andrew Cole and Sophie Cole from interfering in Henry Cole's financial or personal affairs, including but not limited to property, accounts, or insurance policies. She closed the file with finality. This matter is resolved. Across the aisle, Andrew's face drained of color. Sophie whispered frantically, her hands flying in small gestures. Their lawyer leaned close, speaking in a low voice, but they both shook their heads. Andrew tried to stand, saying something about misunderstandings, about only wanting to help, but the bailiff motioned him back down. His words sounded smaller than he meant, excuses that floated and fell. Dana gathered our papers with steady hands. She looked at me and gave a single nod. The sound of the gavel echoed, and just like that, the storm that had built for months broke apart. I left the courthouse with the sun warming my shoulders. In my wallet, tucked behind my license, I kept the photograph of Evelyn in her garden hat. I pulled it out for a moment, let the light touch it, and whispered, "We did it, Ev. We held the ground." My steps felt lighter on the stone stairs, but I knew the story wasn't over. A court victory was one thing. Living beyond the wreckage was another. I climbed into my truck, set the folder on the passenger seat, and looked at the road stretching back toward home. Andrew and Sophie had walked out the other side of the courthouse with their heads low, their voices tight. But their shadows would linger. The money they had reached for was locked beyond their grasp now, but the scars remained. As I drove, I thought of what would come next. The house still stood with its photographs on the wall. The cabin still looked out over the lake. The trust held its shape. The insurance policy sat unaltered. But life was not the same. I knew Chapter 5 of this journey would be about living free again, about choosing peace after betrayal. For now, though, I let myself breathe in the sound of justice, the echo of Sophie's protests, the sag of Andrew's shoulders when the judge said no. The firm weight of Dana's binder closed like a book finished. The courtroom had given me back my name, my assets, my dignity. And yet I carried forward not triumph alone, but a question Evelyn would have asked. What will you do with your freedom, Henry? How will you live the days that remain? I smiled faintly at the photo in my wallet and whispered, I'll figure it out, Ev, I promise. The fight is done, but the living is next. The courthouse doors closed behind me, but the echo of the gavel stayed in my chest for days. It had been the sound of something breaking loose, like chains that had clattered off after months of being locked tight. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't moving in defense. I was moving forward. I knew the fight was not just about winning against Andrew and Sophie in that courtroom. It was about setting my house in order, shoring up the walls, making sure no hand could ever reach inside again without my say. Dana called me the very next morning. She was brisk, steady, already listing steps. Now that the guardianship petition has been denied, we need to make this win airtight. Henry, we'll finalize the deed transfer into the trust. That puts Maple Harbor out of reach for anyone who tries again. We'll add protective layers to your insurance and your accounts. This is about more than victory. It's about permanence. I drove to her office with the same blue folder I had carried through every meeting. But this time I added fresh documents, copies of the court's protective order, the judge's denial, and my own handwritten notes from the hearing. Dana smiled when I set them down. She had already drawn up the deed transfer. All I had to do was sign. The cabin, which Evelyn and I had built with our bare hands and filled with decades of summers, now lived inside the trust's walls like a fortress. She explained each paragraph until I could repeat it in plain words. No sale, no mortgage, no shift could happen without my signature. My hand didn't tremble when I signed. It was steady as a man carving his name in wood. From there, we moved to my insurance. Dana called the company with me in the room. I listened as she explained the fraudulent attempt, read them the protective order, and demanded new layers of security. I set a verbal password, a phrase only I knew. The woman on the line confirmed it would be required for any contact moving forward. "Hold your ground, Henry," I said quietly, and that became the password. Dana's mouth curved into a smile when she heard it. We also updated my medical power of attorney. This time I named someone outside the family, an old friend from the Veterans Hall, a man who had known me for 40 years and had never once asked for $1. Dana said it was wise. Family ties are fragile when money is involved, but trust built in trenches lasts. I felt lighter as each signature dried. Paper, when stacked tall enough, can keep wolves at bay. That week I noticed a change in my mornings. I no longer woke with dread about what Andrew might be plotting. Instead, I thought about the cabin, the smell of pine and lake water, and how to use it in a way that meant more than just my own memories. I began patching small things around the house again, fixing a loose shutter, replacing a porch light. Simple work, but each screw driven in felt like staking a claim over my life again. One afternoon, I stopped at Ellen's hardware store. I bought cedar planks, $140 worth, to repair the porch rail at the Veterans Hall. She wrapped the receipt in a bag and pressed it into my hand. "You're looking more like yourself, Henry," she said. I told her peace isn't silence. Peace is owning the key. She tilted her head, but didn't ask. Some truths are better left to settle on their own. I brewed coffee at home with cinnamon sprinkled on top, the way Evelyn had always made it when the air turned cold. The smell carried me back to mornings when she would hum in the kitchen and I would sit with the newspaper. Now I sat alone, but the cinnamon reminded me I hadn't lost everything. I still had rituals, I still had her porch bench, I still had her trust in me to hold ground. Meanwhile, word traveled faster than I expected. Small towns carry stories like wind carries leaves. I heard through neighbors that Andrew and Sophie had moved into a smaller apartment across town. Their house, with its manicured yard and two-car garage, had gone up for sale. Someone mentioned Sophie's investment consulting had drawn questions from the tax office. I didn't rejoice in their trouble, but I didn't pity it either. Choices carry weight, and their choices had caught up with them. Andrew left me a voicemail one evening. His voice was tight, too polite, asking to sit down and talk things through. I listened to it twice, not for what he said, but for what he didn't. There was no apology, no admission, just a request to open a door that had already closed. I didn't block his number, but I didn't return the call either. Boundaries don't always need words. Silence can speak for you. Instead of engaging with him, I poured my energy into something Evelyn would have applauded. I turned the Maple Harbor cabin into a retreat. I called it Lakeside Haven. Not a business, but a sanctuary for veterans and their families, a place where they could breathe by the water and sit by a fire that didn't judge. I put $25,000 a year from the trust's earnings into its upkeep. Dana helped me set it up legally so it would stand even after I was gone. On the porch, I placed a new bench carved with the words, Evelyn's Porch. When I sat there with a mug of coffee, watching the lake catch the light, I felt her presence more than anywhere else. Children of veterans came running with fishing rods, their laughter carrying across the water. I realized peace isn't passive. Peace is something you build, nail by nail, dollar by dollar, moment by moment. One evening, sitting by the fire pit, I thought about Andrew again. I pulled out my phone, typed a message, and read it 3 times before sending. I wish you well. My boundary stands. That was all. Short, final, not cruel, but firm. A line carved in stone. He didn't reply, and I didn't need him to. The months rolled into a rhythm. I fixed the roof of the Veterans Hall with cedar planks. I walked the path around the lake each morning, breathing the scent of wet leaves and pine. I ate simply, oatmeal with cinnamon, soup in the evenings, and sometimes stew with neighbors. The heaviness in my chest had eased, replaced by something quieter. Freedom, perhaps, or simply relief. The town, too, shifted its gaze. At the diner, people nodded at me in respect instead of pity. At church, someone squeezed my shoulder and said they admired how I held my ground. Even in the grocery line, Raj smiled wider when he saw me. My identity wasn't just the man betrayed by his son. I had again become the man who lived by the lake, who served veterans, who fixed things, who kept his dignity intact. But the contrast between me and Andrew grew sharper with every story I heard. He was seen arguing in the parking lot of a bank. Sophie was overheard complaining about lost clients. Their circle had shrunk and invitations stopped coming. People who once saw them as polished and successful now saw cracks in their facade. I did not celebrate their fall, but I couldn't deny the symmetry. Choices had consequences. One Sunday, while clearing brush near the cabin, I paused and looked across the water. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky orange. I said aloud, I don't need them anymore. I have myself. It wasn't said in bitterness, but in clarity. For months I had felt erased, stripped, cornered. Now I felt rooted, present, standing in a space I had reclaimed. A letter arrived 1 week later, handwritten in Andrew's script. He tried to apologize in halting words, mentioning pressure, mistakes, and stress. He asked if we could start over. I read it at the kitchen table, the lamp casting light across the lines. For a moment, a memory of him as a boy flashed, holding a toy truck, laughing with Evelyn. But the man who had forged signatures and filed petitions was not that boy anymore. I folded the letter, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it in a drawer I rarely opened. I didn't answer. Some boundaries remain even when words are soft. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 3 below to let me know you're here with me. With each passing season, my life grew simpler. I planted tomatoes in the backyard, shared them with neighbors. I joined a book club at the library where I sat with others my age and read aloud lines that made us smile. I drove to the cabin on Fridays, unlocked the door, and watched families find rest there. I started keeping a guest book on the table, where people wrote thank you notes. One family left a letter that read, "This weekend healed something in us we didn't know was broken." I pressed my hand against the page and whispered, "Thank you, Ev. This is your doing as much as mine." Gee, the money that once felt like a target now felt like a tool. I wasn't hoarding it or fearing it. I was directing it, shaping it, using it for a purpose. The trust produced enough to keep me comfortable and the retreat alive. The house remained mine. The photos still lined the stairwell, Evelyn's smile still above the mantel. I had learned the hardest truth. Wealth without boundaries invites wolves. Wealth with wisdom builds havens. In quiet moments, I sat on the porch and reflected. Family had betrayed me, but I had survived by standing firm. Blood had sought to erase me, but paper, truth, and courage had kept me whole. The lesson was sharp but simple. Family is not whoever shares your last name. Family is whoever respects your dignity. I often thought about the judge's voice when she said, "This matter is resolved." The words had become more than a legal closure, they had become a marker in my heart. Resolved didn't mean forgotten. Resolved meant carried forward with new strength. On a rainy Tuesday, I received another letter, this time not from Andrew, but from the insurance company. It was a simple confirmation my account was locked with the verbal password and no changes could be made without me present. I laughed when I read the phrase in the letter. "Hold your ground, Henry." I tucked it into the folder and realized Evelyn's words now lived in more than memory. They were embedded in the very systems around me. As spring drew near, I prepared the cabin for its first official retreat weekend. I scrubbed floors, washed windows, and stocked firewood. I placed fresh sheets on the beds and brewed coffee with cinnamon for the first guests. When they arrived, a young veteran with his wife and 2 children, I watched their shoulders drop as they stepped onto Evelyn's porch. They breathed in the pine air and smiled. That sight alone was worth every battle. Later that night, after they had gone to bed, I sat alone by the fire. I held Evelyn's photograph and spoke softly. "We did it, Ev. We turned betrayal into shelter. We turned loss into legacy." The flames cracked, the lake rippled in the dark, and I felt the kind of peace you cannot buy with money, only earn with endurance. I knew Andrew might call again, Sophie might complain, rumors might swirl. But none of it could touch me now. My trust was fortified, my accounts locked, my assets shielded. More than that, my heart was steady. I had lived through the worst storm a man can face, betrayal from his own blood, and I had come out not erased, but engraved with new strength. The story was closing now, but not in bitterness. I didn't hate them. I didn't even wish them harm. I wished them learning. I wished them a mirror clear enough to see themselves. For me, I had had enough. A house, a cabin, a folder of documents, a community that nodded when I passed, and above all, a sense of self that no petition could strip away. As I prepared to lock the cabin one Sunday evening, I found a letter tucked under the door. It was from a family who had stayed the weekend before. They wrote, "Thank you for giving us space to breathe. My husband hasn't laughed in months, but here he did." I read it twice, smiled, and placed it in the guest book. Tomorrow we will host our first spring weekend officially under the name Lakeside Haven. I whispered to Evelyn, "Tomorrow we start something new." And I knew in my bones that betrayal had lost its hold. What remained was legacy, peace, and the unshakable truth that self-respect is the greatest inheritance a man can carry. Mornings at the cabin had taken on a rhythm I had grown to love. The smell of pine mixed with the faint smoke of the fireplace, the quiet surface of the lake catching the early light, and the creak of the old floorboards under my slippers, it was a rhythm that whispered of peace. I would rise before the sun, put a kettle on, and brew coffee with cinnamon, just the way Evelyn used to. Then I would sit by the window with my ledger, writing down every dollar spent that month. $1,480 had gone to repairing the furnace at the retreat. $320 went to stocking the pantry with food for the families who came through. Numbers once felt like a battlefield, with every check and account a target. Now they felt like stones in a foundation. Each entry proved I was still in control, still the one holding the key. Some mornings, I walked the trail around the property. I had renamed it Evelyn's Loop, a simple half-mile that wound through tall trees and circled back to the porch. When groups of veterans or their families came, I would take them along the path, pointing out where deer often passed or where wildflowers grew in spring. It wasn't much, but they walked quietly, breathing deeper, letting their shoulders fall. That was the gift Evelyn had given me by building this place with me, the gift of sanctuary. Yet even in the stillness, lessons pressed against my chest. Family, I realized, was not blood alone. Family was whoever respected your no. That single word, so often ignored, had nearly cost me everything. I looked at my father's old pocket watch on the table, its brass worn smooth by his hands. It ticked steadily, reminding me that real value was not in titles, deeds, or bank accounts. It was in character, in boundaries, in knowing where you end and another begins. I had lost much, but I had found something unshakable. Of course, Andrew was not gone from my life entirely, though I had closed the door. One afternoon, an email arrived. He wrote in clipped sentences, asking to meet alone, without Sophie. He said he wanted to explain that he had been pressured, that he had made mistakes. I read it once, twice, and then answered with only 2 words. Not now. Ciao, dude. I didn't delete the message, but I didn't read it again. Later, I heard whispers that Sophie was trying to sell off pieces of an investment that had failed, scrambling to cover debts. It was not my concern anymore. They had chosen their road. I had chosen mine. The contrast between us was almost too clear. I spent my afternoons hammering new cedar planks onto the porch rail or sweeping pine needles from the path. I ate simple meals, soup with crusty bread, fresh tomatoes from the small garden I planted, or oatmeal with cinnamon in the mornings. At night I read by lamplight, sometimes the Bible, books from the library. My life was plain but grounded. Meanwhile, Andrew and Sophie's names surfaced in town with a different tone. People whispered about their arguments in the bank lobby, their quiet exit from social circles, the way they seemed smaller, dimmer. Failure clung to them, not because of money, but because of how they had chased it. One evening, during a retreat weekend, a young veteran lingered by the fire pit after others had gone inside. His face was lined, though he couldn't have been more than 30. He said softly, "This is the first time in years I feel safe." I looked at him, at the flicker of flames in his tired eyes, and I nodded. "That's the point," I told him. "That's why this place stands." He smiled faintly, and for a moment I thought of Evelyn again. Safe. That was what she had always tried to make for us. As the months stretched on, my reflections deepened. I thought about what all of this had meant, not only for me, but for others who might listen to this story. Parents, for one. We give so much. We work extra hours, pay tuition, cover weddings, buy cars, write checks until our hands cramp, all in the hope our children stand taller. But there is a danger in giving without teaching. The lesson for parents is this: love does not mean erasing yourself. Love needs boundaries. We can help, but we must also show where our line is drawn. If we never teach them to honor no, we leave them blind to limits, and that blindness can turn to betrayal. And what about children? I often thought of Andrew as a boy, his laughter, his bright eyes when I handed him the keys to that first car. Children must understand this truth. Respect is worth more than inheritance. You may inherit money, property, or businesses, but if you lose respect for the hands that gave them, you lose your own soul in the bargain. The lesson for children is not just gratitude, though that matters. It is reverence for the sacrifices carved into every dollar, every brick, every acre. When respect dies, betrayal is born. But beneath it all, I saw something wider, something about the nature of people in this modern world. We live in a time when money and power whisper louder than family dinners, louder than old photographs on the wall. The world teaches that success is measured in square footage, in account balances, in the shine of a new car. But that lesson is hollow. The truth is this: character is the one asset no one can steal. Titles can be forged, signatures faked, bank accounts drained, but character remains. In a world that prizes gain, we forget the deeper wealth of integrity. My story was not only about Andrew and Sophie, it was about remembering, in the storm of greed, that who you are matters more than what you hold. One day, a letter arrived in the mailbox at the cabin. It was not from Andrew, not from Sophie. It was from a family who had stayed the weekend before. A little girl had drawn a picture inside, crayon lines of a lake, a cabin, and a man on a bench with gray hair. Her mother had written, "Thank you for giving us a place where laughter returned. My husband hasn't smiled like that in years." I sat with that letter in my lap for a long time, the drawing bright against my hands. It was a small thing, just paper and wax, but it carried more worth than any dollar. It reminded me that my battles had not ended in emptiness. They had carved space for joy, for others, and for myself. I placed the drawing in the guest book at Lakeside Haven. Each time I saw it, I felt steadier. Tomorrow, I told myself, another family will walk Evelyn's loop, another child will laugh on her porch. That was the true inheritance I wanted to leave behind. At night, when I closed the shutters and turned off the porch light, I no longer felt fear of being erased. The lake wind moved softly through the trees, the cabin stood strong, and my heart felt light. I thought of Andrew's email, Sophie's debts, their shrinking circle. I thought of my silence, my choice not to answer. That was the closure I needed. I didn't need to fight them anymore. My battle had been won by living, by choosing, by building. So what did I learn? For parents, set your boundaries early. Teach that no is not cruelty, but guidance. For children, never forget the weight behind what you are given. Gratitude is not enough. Respect is the currency that keeps families alive. And for all of us, in this modern, grasping world, remember that character outlives wealth. It is the one inheritance no thief can take, no paper can forge, no court can erase. As I locked the cabin one evening, I looked out across the lake. The sky was painted in gold and violet. I whispered to myself, I finally found where I belong. It wasn't in money, or in Andrew's approval, or in the fight. It was in peace, in knowing I had stood firm, in carrying Evelyn's legacy forward. Every day that I woke here was proof that I had chosen right. I have no doubt Andrew will try again to reach me. He may write more letters, leave more messages. But I will not answer. My boundary stands. I don't need their apology. I don't need reconciliation that is only words. What I need, I already have. Myself, my dignity, my cabin, my community, my peace. And that is enough. The story has come to an end. I hope it has brought you valuable lessons and insights. If you enjoyed this content, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next video. Goodbye, and see you again.